All right, I think we're ready to start. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar, co-organized by Puro.earth and Boundless on understanding additionality in carbon removal. My name is Solène Chiquier. I'm an eligibility manager at Puro, and I will be hosting the session today. I am joined by my colleagues from Boundless, Melissa Harclerode, who's Director of Research, and by Reagan Cerci, Senior Research Analyst. So just to give you some headlines, today is going to be a 30-minute session with about 20 minutes of presentation, and that will be followed by about 10 minutes for your questions. So feel free to use the Q&A to put your questions in there at any time, and we will address them by the end of that presentation during the Q&A session. All right, so what is additionality? An additional project is one that would not have occurred without the incentive that is provided by carbon credit revenues. And so evaluating additionality is very essential for determining the quality as well as the credibility of carbon removal credits. Additionality is typically assessed once by the crediting program like Puro, and that's during the project approval and registration at the very beginning. In practice, we can say that additionality is determined by assessing whether the proposed carbon removal project is different from its baseline scenario, what we usually refer as what would have happened in future business as usual in the absence of any carbon revenue incentives. What it means is that if a project is deemed not additional, meaning that it would not have been undertaken regardless of carbon credit revenues, then in principle, that project and its baseline scenario would be the same. So when we think about additionality, legal, financial, and other considerations all come into play, and each must be assessed for a project to be considered additional. So first, we have what we call the carbon additionality. What it means is that a project must remove more CO2 than it would have been removed in a business as usual scenario. And so that baseline, importantly, is not always simply what would have happened in the absence of the project. It may also include an alternative use of the proposed project resources, for example, the biomass feedstock or the material that would have been carbonated. So in other words, saying that a carbon removal project is additional means that it achieves greater net removal than what would have occurred under the most likely alternative scenario. Then we have financial additionality. So that one requires that a project relies on revenue from carbon credits to move forward. So put simply, it means that the expectation of selling credits must play a decisive role in the decision to implement the project. If the project would have happened anyway because it is already profitable without the credits, then the credits themselves are not generating a real climate benefit. For example, a DAC plant would very likely only get built because investors expect income from credit sales to actually generate negative emissions and therefore is financially additional. But if we take a profitable bioenergy plant that decides to capture CO2 to save on energy costs, then that would not qualify. The last element is regulatory additionality, which means that a project must go beyond what it is already required by law. Said differently, if a project's activities are mandated by regulation, then carrying them out does not count as additional. So now, why does additionality matter? And that perhaps from the buyer's perspective. So as you can see, many elements here to say. So first, we think that it is about reputation and trust. If credits are not additional, then buyers risk being accused of greenwashing. Second, without additionality, it's fair to say that climate claims can lose all credibility. Things like carbon neutral or net zero statements will not stand up, and that can lead to legal, regulatory, or even consumer backlash. Third, we need to think about our investors. We do think that investors want companies to show real and credible action, and non-additional credits can look like shortcuts rather than long-term solutions. Fourth, we also think that regulation is about to tighten. Governments are setting stricter rules And in the future, we really think that only truly additional credits will matter. And finally, it is about the market integrity itself. If non-additional credits are accepted, then it's the entire voluntary carbon market that risks losing value and credibility. And now I will hand it over to Melissa and Reagan for a deep dive into a few case studies focusing on sustainability and cost analysis.
Great, thank you so much, Solène. Before we present the case studies, just want to spend 2 slides to provide a quick introduction to Boundless for those of you not familiar with us. We are a science-based research and analytics firm, women business enterprise, and we use life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis methods to quantify relevant environmental, cost, socioeconomic, and performance metrics for a particular project, technology, as well as the benchmark of those business as usual, competitive technologies to do that apples to apples comparison. Our service level ranges from 3-week assessments to comprehensive organizational scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions accounting, or assessment of multiple environmental and cost key performance indicators in the format of reports, calculators, and impact scans. And these charts just show some of our comparative data visualizations. So with that said, let's talk about the X Prize carbon dioxide removal competition case studies that Reagan's going to present on in just a moment. And additionality played a major role in the LCAs and TEAs that Boundless performed for this competition. The sustainability assessment evaluated at the demo scale, sequestration durability claims, at the gigaton and megaton scale, feasibility in terms of energy sourcing, feedstock availability, and then also we looked at the social license to operate. The life cycle assessment key performance indicators we focused on were carbon intensity and cumulative energy demand based on net removal of carbon to account for the amount of carbon that remains after accounting for the emissions generated throughout the removal process, such as energy use, manufacturing, disposal. And net removal is the more accurate measure of a project's positive impact on the climate because it subtracts the project's own carbon footprint from its total removal. That's really important to consider as you're integrating additionality into your modeling. And just to lightly touch upon our TEA framework before handing it off to Reagan, we focused on cost of removal as the key metric. And we performed a series of sensitivity analysis to understand how changes in key parameters affect overall cost. And this helped us identify the most critical cost drivers and areas for improvement that have the biggest impact. But most importantly, because the TEA is based on net carbon removed, again, this just stresses the importance of considering additionality in a way that's science-driven, technically sound, because that connects back to the way we're evaluating the cost. And now I'll hand it over to Reagan, and she'll touch upon a few case studies associated with the X Prize CDR competition.
Sure. Thank you, Melissa. So I'm going to walk through some case studies here. This first one that we're looking at is a biochar company. And so they're doing a carbon capture and storage technology through this mobile pyrolysis unit, and they're converting what was agricultural waste to a biochar for soil application. And on the right here, you can see the performance metrics. The pie chart is essentially showing you the net ton CO2 removed, and then below you can see a cost of removal compared to benchmarks across the carbon removal industry as well. And so essentially, when you're looking at additionality for a project like this, there are a few things you really want to touch on and make sure that the project is hitting. So the first one would be the financial additionality risk. So if agricultural processors or farmers are already implementing biochar for soil amendment benefits, so yield, soil health, waste disposal, the revenue model from the carbon credits may not be strictly necessary for project viability. Another one is what we call the common practice risk. So if mobile pyrolysis and biochar application is widely practiced in the region, it's going to be hard to demonstrate the novelty or that the carbon removal is beyond the business as usual. Then we have this permanent stability uncertainty. So soil applied biochar may degrade, oxidize, re-release carbon over longer timeframes. So it's important to make sure that you're looking and being very clear on the time frame that you're assessing and that you're demonstrating permanence reliably, and that you're verifying those additionality claims and in the permanence of the CO2 that is stored. There's also a risk of leakage or displacement. So if you're diverting agricultural waste to biochar and that reduces feedstock availability for other beneficial uses, so compost or energy, that's already existing in the region, those net emissions might actually shift elsewhere, which can complicate any claims of additionality. And then the last one here, we have methodological or measurement barriers. So we really want to make sure that we're following protocols as closely as possible. There are a few different protocols out there for measuring carbon retained in the biochar, as well as soil stability over decades. And that could weaken the verification or certification claims. So these are all things that we're checking for in biochar specific projects to make sure that they are aligned with the additionality requirements that we've previously discussed. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So the second case study we're looking at is in algae farming technology as a carbon capture and storage approach. In this case, they're farming kelp. And again, you can see these metrics on the right here, where it's 530.5 kilograms, negative 530.5 kilograms CO2e per net ton of CO2 removed. And in this case, it was quite a bit more expensive than what we have benchmarked as the competitor or across the industry ranges. So there are also some additionality challenges and things that we're checking for in something like kelp farming. So we want to make sure that it's not already profitable through existing markets. So oftentimes in kelp farming, you're harvesting a good portion of the kelp and using it for a food, a fertilizer, animal feed, or even quite commonly bioplastics. So if there's a significant amount of revenue coming through those streams, then it might not meet the additionality requirements. Then we have this common practice risk. Again, if it's already expanding commercially in the region for other purposes, going to make that claim a little bit more difficult and claiming that it's non-business as usual. And then there's a permanence and storage uncertainty. So oftentimes the permanence approach in something like kelp farming is deep sea sinking. So essentially over time, the kelp will die, fall to the bottom of the ocean and be stored for a very long time. However, there are a couple different ways to calculate or estimate how much of that kelp is actually making it to the deep sea floor and how long it would be stored. So making sure that we're checking in on those permanence and storage claims as well. And then again, regulatory or methodological gaps. Like I said, there are a couple different ways to calculate how much carbon is actually being stored long-term. And if that carbon is being used for a bioplastic we need to make sure that, how quickly will the bioplastic degrade? Are we looking on a cradle to grave scale? So everything from raw material production and manufacturing, the growing of the kelp, to the disposal of the bioplastic. What happens to the waste when it is done being used? So another concern might be a dependence on a co-product market. So if the majority of the biomass is used in those short-lived products rather than long-term sequestration, it may be more of an avoided emission or temporary storage, and then not eligible as permanent carbon removal. And so really we want to check in to make sure that something like kelp farming is hitting those points. And those are the primary risks we would be looking for to make sure that we're hitting additionality. Next slide. So what wouldn't fit under additionality, right? So an existing reforestation project. So if a landowner has been planting trees for decades as part of a commercial timber operation, that's not necessarily incentivized by the carbon market. It pretty much is already there. I have also seen cases of something like this where people will cut down existing old growth forests and plant new trees, and claim that as a carbon sink, which you have to really consider the land use change there as well. If it's mandatory industrial capture, so that's a regulation that already requires a power plant or a factory to capture and store the CO2. So under some of the California low carbon fuel standard, you have to capture CO2. And so something like that wouldn't fall under the additionality. It's not additional, it's required. And then business as usual soil practices. So if it's already common and farms practice regenerative tilling or cover cropping, for agronomic reasons, without the carbon credit funding, there's no financial incentive there. And so those are some examples of what wouldn't hit the additionality requirements. Next slide.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Melissa and Reagan. So now that we heard a little bit more about the barriers and the challenges that projects can encounter when trying to demonstrate additionality, and we've seen some nice breakdowns of the carbon emissions versus the amount of carbon removed. Going back to Puro, how is additionality governed at Puro? So at Puro, we basically have 3 key documents that talk about it and regulate it. First, we have the general rules of the Puro standard. We also have a very specific document that is called the Additionality Assessment Requirements. And then, of course, for every specific project, we have the associated methodology that talks about it as well. And all of these documents that are shown here on the screen can be found on our website in our library. So if you really want to go into the very specific details, the very specific rules, you can go on our website and download these documents. Something important to note is that at Puro, additionality gets audited first at the very beginning of what we call the crediting period, which happens during the first audit, the production facility audit. And that additionality gets audited again at any renewal of that crediting period. So how does it work really in practice? How do you really demonstrate additionality? So as a supplier, what you have to do is fill out what we call our baseline additionality questionnaire. So in that questionnaire, you will first describe how your project is not legally required, as Reagan was mentioning earlier. You will also explain briefly, basically the outcome of your LCA. You will have to explain why your project removes more CO2 than the baseline scenario. So again, what Reagan has been explaining earlier. And then the questionnaire will guide you on what kind of financial analysis you have to conduct to demonstrate your financial additionality. And so second, this is where you will have to provide that evidence of financial additionality. For that, there are multiple routes to go through. You can either go through a simple cost analysis or an investment analysis that shows that your project is not viable without carbon credits, or you can opt for what we call a barrier analysis that shows that your project faces too many challenges that alternatives do not. And depending on the maturity of your project, you may have to go through a common practice analysis that we've already heard about as well. That shows that your project is not just business as usual. What matters here at Puro is that common practice analysis is only required if your project has reached a high level of maturity. So how does it work in practice? I will not go into the very details of that diagram, which may be a little bit complicated, but the idea is as follows. So first, you need to check whether you need to go through that common practice analysis. And for that, you need to check whether your technology is already mature, usually with a TRL of 8 or 9, and in order to assess whether it is indeed widely used in the market. Let's say that your technology is indeed very mature. That's when you have to do your common practice analysis. So that is step 2. For that, you will check whether the market penetration rate is high or not. If it is indeed high, then unfortunately your activity will be considered common practice and is therefore not additional. However, if that rate is low, then you can actually continue to the next steps to demonstrate financial additionality. So that is step 3, where you need to decide whether you will do your barrier analysis or whether you will pick one of 2 financial analysis options. Let's say you decide to go through this barrier analysis. In that case, you will have to show that your project faces barriers such as technical, institutional, or financial, and that only carbon revenues can help overcome these. If rather you decide to go for a financial analysis, you will have to determine which analysis applies to your project. For that, you will have to ask yourself rather, whether your project have other income streams besides carbon finance, or whether the capital expenditure is a major cost in your project. If the answer to one of these questions is yes, you will have to go through a rather comprehensive investment analysis. However, if the answer is no, then you can opt for something that we call a simple cost analysis. The level of detail of these 2 analyses really is the main difference between these 2. However, the goal is the same, to assess whether carbon credit revenues make the project financially viable or whether it improves its returns beyond a reasonable benchmark. So in conclusion, what we can say is that additionality really is about carbon, regulatory, and financial considerations, and all 3 must be met for a project to be really additional. We've seen that carbon additionality can be verified through a life cycle analysis. Financial additionality ensures that a project would not occur without support of carbon finance. And finally, regulatory additionality ensures that the project goes beyond existing legal requirements. We've also seen that it matters because it helps build trust and credibility of the entire voluntary carbon market. It supports resilient long-term climate solutions, and it ensures alignment with future strong regulations. And so overall, by ensuring that projects meet all of these 3 additionality criteria, we can enable credible climate claims, which aligns with all of these elements. That being said, I'm happy to take over questions. So let's see what we have in the Q&A. Maybe Megan or Melissa wants to start. Thanks.
Yeah, we have a good amount of questions in the Q&A, so this is excellent. I see a few questions pertaining to using feedstocks, different types of feedstocks for either biochar application or enhanced rock weathering, and what that means in terms of counterfactual and leakage impacts. So I'll provide a general response. In those particular scenarios, you need to develop a decision-based consequential baseline that asks, if this ton of feedstock didn't go to a CDR project, what would most likely happen instead? And what emissions would that cause elsewhere? So that captures the counterfactual, that baseline fate, and then the leakage, which is what emissions could potentially happen if there was that disruption in the feedstock supply chain. And this is something we've been discussing recently as an example where biochar as a particular cake, if it's not applied for CDR, land applied, in certain parts of the world, it's used by lime kiln workers to, do their process. And if the cake goes away, the question is, do they then revert back to coal-based energy, or can they use a different feedstock for their cake? So going through that type of LCA exercise will help you answer those questions. Reagan, I will punt it over to you to select a question to respond to. Yeah.
So there's a question here. It says, how do you check permanent deep sea storage claims in practice? Not possible. Moreover, it's inaccurate to claim that biological carbon is stored for a long time in the deep sea. Depending on the specific conditions of that region, a significant portion of the biomass will be rapidly digested and returned to the ocean carbon cycle, but we cannot track how much. So I wanted to highlight this one because it's a good point in terms of deep sea carbon storage claims. As I was saying, it is extremely difficult to track. In terms of the work we did with the X Prize, we were mostly looking to determine that they had done enough research and had the theoretical backing to support a certain percentage. I believe it was small. It was something around 7% of the total carbon, but don't quote me on it, actually ended up in the deep sea. And they did have a good amount of backing research, published literature to support that. But you are correct that it is extremely difficult. And I am by no means an expert in the deep sea storage of carbon, but I did want to bring it up because it is a good point that it is a difficult thing to track.
Well, I think I spotted a couple of questions about further guidance as to how to demonstrate financial additionality, questions about the difference between investment analysis and simple cost analysis. So again, all the detailed explanations are provided on our website, where you can find every single rule and guidance as to how to demonstrate all of these different elements. Just again, as a very brief recap, with a simple cost analysis, we would ask a supplier to very briefly share their CapEx, OpEx, and show how the project does not make it without carbon credits. With an investment analysis, we would have much more, let's say, comprehensive requirements. For example, an investment analysis have to be conducted over a 10-year period. You must really you must really demonstrate that your project is not viable without the carbon credits, or to show that it does not meet an acceptable benchmark. So that investment analysis is much more thorough. Again, what really makes the difference between having to do the first one or the second one is whether your project has other sources of revenue beside carbon credits. And whether the CapEx is significant or not. For example, for enhanced rock weathering projects, we tend to agree that the CapEx can be relatively not that significant compared to OpEx relative to other projects. So again, yes, all the material can be found on our websites.
Great. I'll pick up another question. I see some questions in here in terms of how long like monitoring, verification, and reporting take and the cost associated with that, and whether that was part of the cost of removal that we showed earlier. So for the verification, monitoring, reporting process, that is ongoing because you need to continuously and periodically illustrate that your project continues to remove carbon. And that's going to be specific to the accreditation organization that you're getting your credits from, and Puro.earth has that as part of their methodology pretty clearly stated. A good thing to realize is when you're establishing your baseline, you do also need to collect some data in terms of, I guess, biochar, like your soil chemistry, soil organic carbon, and how some of that may change via biochar application. For the costs, we did not include the cost of the monitoring, verification, and reporting in the cost of removal, so I don't have an answer to that specifically, but I would say it's really laboratory costs and field sampling costs, which typically aren't a same dollar size amount as actually like building and implementing the project. So it's not a big financial ask in terms of the MVR.
I see a couple of questions about biochar. For example, I've seen a question that is asking about, how come biochar could be sold on its own, and therefore why should we need carbon credits for that? So maybe as a general comment, we may see some trends in terms of costs. Carbon credits may have price ranges that are common per type of CO2 removal technologies, but every project at the end of the day is unique, depending on where it is implemented, depending on how the technology that is used to turn biomass feedstock into biochar, and depending on the socio-economic context of the project. Biochar may not actually have a market there, which makes, and what we've seen with projects is that actually quite often we do see biochar projects which do not necessarily have any other revenue sources besides carbon credits. Let me see another question, perhaps. There was a question about what happens if the project fails to meet some of all the additionality elements. So maybe again, in terms of timeline and process, additionality is something that is verified when the project gets to be certified at the very beginning. It is not something that is checked afterwards. So you can CDR credits cannot be issued before having the additionality checked. So if during that assessment, let's say we find out that the project is not financially additional, or that it actually does not remove more CO2 than the baseline, then that project will never turn into credits. And actually another question that I've seen about the financial additionality, it is important about the confidentiality of this analysis. It is really important to say that these financial analyses are confidential, and only Puro.earth and the auditor will have access to these, except of course if the supplier decides to share them publicly, in which case they will be published on Puro registry. But these studies, we do understand how sensitive some of this data can be, and so of course this data is very confidential and treated as such. I do see a couple of questions about baseline as well. In particular, this one, in biochar projects, the baseline is generally considered zero. Could you illustrate a case where this assumption does not hold? So it's actually a very good question. Thank you. So we at Puro, we have just released our new methodology for biochar edition 2025, in which we are much more comprehensive and give much more information about additionality, the different baseline scenarios that exist. And so in the context of biochar, you might think that you can indeed produce biochar from scratch, from biomass through a pyrolysis equipment. And in that case, you are right, baseline might be 0, depending on but you might also have cases where you are going to retrofit actually already existing facilities, typically the case of bioenergy plants that were already combusting biomass and were already producing ash. And so in that kind of situations, it is very, very important to be very precise and accurate when quantifying the carbon content that was previously contained in these ashes and assess whether these ashes were even at all considered eligible for carbon credits. So that is based on their compositions, their organic carbon content, their hydrogen content as well. So you may have different situations where the baseline might be not considered 0 for biochar.
I see a question here on forest carbon sinks, which is something we haven't touched upon. There are a lot of agencies working on accreditation for biodiversity and creation of new carbon sinks, maintaining existing stocks, or enhancing those sequestration rates. I would say they follow the same type of rigor and considerations as we're presenting here in terms of the biochar and CDR projects. One thing I have learned though recently is that the industry is moving to monitoring these forest carbon credits based on a dynamic changing environment because climate change is changing the ecosystems. So there's a lot more of a dynamic monitoring and reassessment as part of those forest-based carbon credits.
I see a question about again about the financial additionality of I think biochar projects. That this question is about whether projects are allowed or could generate an income from using biochar as a side amendment and still be considered additional. So that could be the case, yes, indeed. Again, what really matters is to be able to compare the financial, is to look at the financials of the project without the revenues from carbon credits and assess whether without carbon credits, that project would make sense financially, whether it would be financially available. And then the question is, if the answer to that is yes, if your project is viable simply by selling your biochar as a side amendment, then no, your project will not be additional. However, if you manage to demonstrate that it is not additional, that it does not meet that typical benchmark, then in that case, your project could be additional, yes. Perhaps let's take 1 or 2 last questions and then.
I see one question just around proof for counterfactual scenarios. And I mean, Solène, you can definitely add to what I have to say, but I would say proof is in documentation, in evidence, as well as in doing interviews with the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by your project, by feedstock supply chain availability and redistributing accordingly. So I would say that proof is true documentation, either in like invoicing, bills of lading, interviews with stakeholders. I don't know, Solène, if you have other types of proof or evidence you would add to that list?
Sure. I feel like we've been talking a lot about financial additionality, but let's not forget carbon additionality. When we review life cycle analysis, every single number, every single data has to be proved, as you were just saying, Melissa. So it's really important to be able to trace back to things like deliveries, but let's not forget the carbon content of the biochar itself. So lab analyses are very important, and the representativeness of this lab analysis also matters very, very much. This is something, again, that was really improved in the latest biochar methodology that Puro recently released. Let me think of something else. Yes, I think that's already a good start. Yes. All right. Well, I think we've had a good session, and maybe that can be it for today. Well, in that case, thank you very much, everyone, for attending our webinar. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Megan and Melissa, to join as well. And I hope everyone learned a little bit more about additionality today.
Yes, thanks everyone. Hope to hear from you. Bye.
Thank
Thank you, everyone. Bye.